So I'm delighted to be here today. I understand there are a lot of dietitians listening to me. I can't ask the people at the distance sites to raise their hands, but how many of you in the room are dietitians? Great. Okay, you're my heroes because you're out there really trying, I mean that, you're out there day to day, after day, trying to change people's behavior, and that's really hard to do. And I know that when you try to change their behavior, you're usually dealing with a health problem, or you're dealing with the prevention of cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And what I'm hoping to do today is convince you that you should also be talking to them about nutrition in terms of things above their neck, brain health. So it's standard to have a disclosure slide. I have no commercial interest in any company or sale of any product, never have, never will. But I also have a disclaimer that's very important for people to know. I'm going to be talking only about nutrition, but I do know, as you know, that mental health is very complicated, and there are lots of causes, lots of other causes that don't directly relate to nutrition. You know what they are. There's some on this slide, violence, abuse, etc. But I'm focusing on nutrition because it's been so overlooked. This is an overview now for my talk. First, I'm going to talk about some bad news. I thought I'd get that stuff out of the way. Then I'll talk a bit about how nutrients work in the brain. Then we'll turn to good news, and then practical ideas for all of us. Okay, we're starting with the bad news. A recent study came out that analyzed the data from the most recent Canadian Community Health Survey. That's the survey across Canada of people ages 22 to 90, not 20 to 92 to 90. They asked what people were eating. And this particular study divided the food intake into the usual categories of whole foods, slightly processed foods, more processed foods, ultra-processed foods. And this was the shocking finding. Basically, if you'll allow me to round up, 50% of the caloric intake of all Canadians was coming from that bottom category. Not necessarily the illustration I used, but you get the idea. It's nutrient-free chemicals, basically, 50%. So we should be asking ourselves, what happens to people, our entire population, whose nutrient intake is 50% of what it should or could be? Now hold that question in mind while I show you something. Do you recognize these characteristics? You know what depression is? You know what depression is? Hysteria is kind of an old-fashioned term. We might call it anxiety or hypomania now. Irritability, you know what that is. We tend to call this self-harm now, etc. In other words, what you have on this screen is basically depression, anxiety, and attention problems. But what actually did they come from? They came from a study at the University of Minnesota, published in 1950. They were very famous, the Minnesota Starvation experiments. They were mainly studying, this was just after World War II, when people being let out of the concentration camps all over, and there was great interest in digestion and gastrointestinal function, but somebody thought to look at mental health. So at the university, they took 36 normal, healthy men, and they subjected them to 6 months of nutrient deprivation at 50%. And these were the symptoms they found. Okay? So now, I would assert that we know the mental health impact of cutting nutrient intake by 50%, and we're experimenting at a population health level. But what if, and I said I'm starting out with all bad news, what if, even in that 50%, what if we're getting fewer minerals and vitamins than our ancestors did? A little review. How many of you in this room have an agricultural background? You grew up on farms? One or two. That's pretty typical when I give talks in urban areas, that very few people have. So maybe you know this, maybe you don't. It won't hurt to review it. Our plants grow in the soil, unless it's hydroponics. And I got to wonder about that situation, but we can talk about it later. In the soil, we hope that there are about 15 minerals which the plants absorb. And those plants are much smarter than we are. they can take those 15 minerals and they synthesize vitamins, which we cannot do except in trivial amounts, and they come up with 30, roughly, minerals and vitamins in the plants. Then we come along, we eat the plants, or we come along and we eat the animals which ate the plants, and we get a broad spectrum of roughly 30 vitamins and minerals. But it all begins in the soil. And what if we don't have 15 minerals in the soil? So the question I want to ask is our soil in good shape? About a year and a half ago, an agricultural expert who I know in the Winnipeg area called me and said, Bonnie, you're always talking about vitamins and minerals and everything. Have you ever looked at the soil? And I said, look, my training is in, research psychology and neurophysiology. I've never looked at the soil. So he said, I'm going to send you a random sample of 40 soil assays from a bunch of 80-some that I have sitting on my desk. And I want you to analyze them and see what you think. So these 40 assays were from across all 4 Western Canadian provinces, which, in case you don't know it, represents almost a third of our cultivated land in Canada. And then I graphed it. Now, what you need to know, you're used to, many of the people in this room or listening to me are used to looking at lab values. And you know there's like a reference range. And the lowest level is the lowest amount it should be. And then up here we have the highest level, and you don't want it over that. So you want it in that window, right? Well, you can do the same thing by using the Albrecht method, assigning a range for each individual mineral. So this is what we found. This is the percent of the 40 fields where the nutrient was above that low bar, okay, in the reference range. I'm going to read to you, in case you can't see it, what it says on the bottom. This is calcium. Let's start there. About 25 or 28% of the fields were within that reference range. That's pretty pathetic because calcium is a really major mineral for plant growth. Magnesium, potassium, sodium, boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, cobalt, molybdenum, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphate. And this, if you just wanted to draw a line, this is an arbitrary line at about 50%, shows you that I'm not saying that Western Canadian soil is okay for magnesium. This is, if we took another 40 samples, we might get a different distribution. The overall message is the important one. It happens that magnesium looks okay, nothing else looks okay. It's really very disturbing. So if it's not in the soil, how can it get into the plants? If it's not in the plants, how can they synthesize our vitamins? And I don't care how beautiful that tomato or apple or orange looks, it might not have the nutrients that we want it to have. Now you're all sitting there thinking, oh, I'm so glad I buy organic food, right? Well, there are good reasons for buying organic food. You buy organic food partly to support organic farmers and partly because you think it's important that we grow things without pesticides and herbicides. But organic does not mean nutrient dense. We happen to have 2 fields from the Winnipeg area which were almost adjacent. One was organic and one not. And this is what we found. I'm just showing you one of the slides from that. And here is the field 1 is the non-organic, that's blue. The green one is organic. And as you can see, none of them are good. I mean, we just really have a problem. So I want to move on to a different topic, but it's still bad news, and it relates to why I'm talking to you about nutrition and the brain. Some of my lectures I entitle Nutrition Above the Neck, but I don't have time today to talk about all the other above the neck related things like dementia and cognitive function. So it's really mental health. So this is a book I discovered just a few years ago. Now, the first author, E. Fuller Torrey, I doubt that you're familiar with him, but he's a really leading psychiatrist in the U.S. He's like the former head of the Stanley Medical Research Institute, etc., a major figure. And I discovered he had written this book with Judy Miller in 2001 and called it The Invisible Plague. What was the invisible plague? Well, they had managed to pull together data on the prevalence of diagnosed mental illness around the world prior to 1750. Believe it or not, there are records on that. In fact, Canada contributed some from the Maritimes. They have records going back that far. And they found the prevalence rate was about 1 in 10,000. And then they also pulled the records from 1750 to 1960, and they found it was 3 in 10,000. And it was that change, a tripling of the prevalence rate, I mean, it doesn't look like a lot, but it's a tripling, that said we have an invisible plague. That was the plague. And by the way, it was just kind of interesting that the Irish famine uniquely had a higher rate, 7 in 10,000. Anybody want to call out some numbers? What do you think it is today? Go big, 20, 25%, some people say, okay? So at least 2,000 or 2,500 in 10,000. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. We have a zillion more diagnostic categories. We have people coming forward for help more, which we want. That's a good thing. We have differing diagnostic criteria, etc. And until about 5 or so years ago, people used to attribute that increased prevalence to all those other factors. But I have to say now, as I follow the psychiatric literature, I don't see people saying that anymore. I think there's a real feeling that there is a genuine increase, but that's not the major. I'm not reviewing that literature, but that's my impression. So, what's the take-home message from all this bad news? Mental health problems are epidemic. Now, again, I can't ask the people at the distance sites, but I can ask those of you in this room. Would you raise your hand if someone that you care about, someone that you love, someone in your family, maybe yourself, is struggling or has struggled with a mental health challenge? Don't raise your hand if it's a client, okay? Okay, and usually it is virtually 100%. And now would you please raise your hand if conventional medication has resolved the problem for those people? Right, and that's, 1, okay. I asked that question at many, many talks. Last week I was telling Laura I was speaking to a group of 900 at the Integrative Mental Health Conference in San Francisco, and 3 people raised their hand at the end out of 900. So, but virtually everyone raised their hand when we asked the question about prevalence. So I thought 3 was pretty good. Anyway, conventional treatments are not helping enough. If they were, the rates would be going down, and that's why people are looking elsewhere. And now I'm going to switch to my second topic. Those of you who came in late, we're done with most of the bad news. I'm going to talk to you now about how nutrients affect the brain. Our brain accounts for only about 2% of our body weight, but it punches way above its weight. It represents, depending on which textbook you're looking at, anywhere from 20 to 50% of the metabolic demands. That means when we're eating, we are really eating to feed our brain. Each of us has about 6 liters of blood inside of us, and 1 liter passes through our brain every 60 seconds that we're alive. When you think about the size of your head and the size of a liter, and that much blood is going through the vasculature in your brain every minute that your heart is pumping, it's really kind of phenomenal, I think. Why so many I should ask, what is that blood doing? Of course, it's bringing nutrients. Of course, more importantly, maybe, it's bringing oxygen. We need that more quickly. And it's doing other things. It's taking away waste products, etc. I get overly focused on nutrition, pardon me. I'm focusing now on the fact that it's bringing nutrients to your brain. So the question is, why have we evolved to need so many nutrients every minute? It really boils down to brain metabolism. Metabolism is just a word that refers to the transformation of one compound to another. So here's a theoretical metabolic step. Suppose that chemical A needs to be metabolized and transformed into chemical B. What does it take to get there? Well, it takes an enzyme. You've heard of enzymatic reactions. But enzymes, you may not know this, enzymes cannot work on their own. They need what we used to call coenzymes, now they're called cofactors. Those cofactors are minerals and vitamins. And only when you have sufficient amounts of minerals and vitamins available to that set of enzymes does that metabolic step happen efficiently. How is this relevant to the brain? The next slide I'm going to show you is one that I've been showing for 15 years to every audience. I mean, to teachers, to children in grade 6 recently, to people in the oil companies I was telling Laura about, to scientific and medical colleagues. And everyone at the end, at first, they kind of go, and at the end they say, that's the slide I'm going to remember. So let me make it memorable for you. This is a tiny, tiny little piece of a very big and complex metabolic pathway involving serotonin. And I selected this just because even 15 years ago, everybody knew what serotonin was. And everybody knew what tryptophan. They recognized these ones that are in red. So that's why they're in red. It's just to draw your attention to the fact that these are chemicals that you've heard of. So what you can do on the internet, oh, by the way, the reason that it's such a tiny piece is it's arbitrarily selected to fit on one slide. I mean, that's all. Otherwise, if you go and look online, you'll see the gigantic metabolism involving serotonin. So you're getting the simple version. Then you can go online and look at every single metabolic step, and that is an arrow. And you can identify the enzymes, and you can ask the question, are there any cofactors that I would recognize that are required for that step to occur? So let's look. Okay, for tryptophan to be broken down, you need iron, phosphorus, and calcium, and you get 5-hydroxyl-tryptophan. Don't worry about these other names. That's one you might recognize. But here you need vitamin B6. Here you need B6, riboflavin, and iron. There's a lot of B6 on this particular segment. In fact, a lot of B vitamins. Niacin, riboflavin, molybdenum. How many of you have had your molybdenum today? Most people have never heard of it. It's a trace mineral, and it's in a lot of our vegetables and should be in our soil. It was on my slide, the soil slide. Zinc is here, iron and niacin is here, vitamin C and iron, etc., etc., and etc. What does that mean? We know from physical health that if people don't have the amount of cofactors that they need at each step, that those pathways are sluggish. That means that if you want optimal functioning of those pathways, you need to be feeding your brain the nutrients that it needs every minute, 24 hours a day. Now, just so you don't think that this is a biased serotonin thing, I want to show you a colleague of mine at Oregon Health and Sciences University recently did the same thing for dopamine. She put it in a circle, and it's the same thing. Here we need B1, B6, zinc. Here we need 5 nutrients, 5, 4, 2, 3, okay? It's the same thing. And we always hear about the omega-3 fatty acids. Well, it's great. We have to all be taking omega-3s. We have to be eating fish. We need to be taking it in a supplementary way if we're non-fish eaters. But, if you don't have the right cofactors on board, you won't get the proper transformation. Here you have the omega-3 pathway being transformed to, you've heard of EPA and DHA. Okay, and these are the enzymes in the middle, and in red are the cofactors that are needed. So again, and this is the omega-6 line to arachidonic acid over here. So again, the cofactors are needed for metabolic transformation of the food that we eat. But the more important bottom line is, the role of nutrients in the brain is not a mystery. How many of you learned this in grade school, in elementary school? How many of you, I don't know if there are any physicians in the audience, how many of you learned it in medical school? I asked this question to the audience of 900 last week, most of whom were physicians. None of them got it in medical school. And that's why I still have physicians saying to me, Bonnie, vitamins and minerals, they really don't do much in the brain, do they? Well, they do everything. They are fundamental. I call them foundational in the brain. But that's just for metabolism. Now, I don't have time to go into it here, but you can trace a similar important role for nutrients in combating inflammation, especially through mitochondrial production of ATP. And my colleagues and I wrote a paper in 2015 that people find very useful. If you're interested, I'll send it to you. I'm going to put my email address up again at the end. And it shows how they all fit together. People want to know, people are talking about inflammation now. They're not talking about the microbiome. Oh, they're talking about oxidative stress. Well, they all fit together. So this paper shows you how inflammation, microbiome, oxidative stress, and mitochondrial function all fit together. And of course, nutrition is kind of the foundational piece tying them all together. I have to move on, though. So the third part of this talk is what I call the good news. The best news of all is that diet is a modifiable risk factor. And I asked early on how many of you are dietitians, because as I often say, dietitians are my heroes, because you're trying to get people to change the way they eat. And it was the famous cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead who said, it's back in the 1950s, I think, it's easier to change a man's religion than it is to change the way he eats. And yeah, you dietitians, if you want that slide, I'll send it to you. It's an amazing comment, and I think it may be true. So, but you're fighting the good fight. So what I want to show you, though, is that modifications are important not only for the things that you usually focus on, which are the disorders you're dealing with and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but they also result in mental improvements. So I want to show you 4 types of data. I've already shown you the first type of data, and that is that first, the University of Minnesota slide. I showed you that nutrient deprivation creates mental health symptoms. I could go back that was only 70 years. I could go back 2,600 years. If you're interested in the history of the relationship between nutrition and mental health and how old that is, the first clinical trial was 2,600 years ago, and I have a 45-minute talk online. If you're interested, I'll send you the link. So I'm going to talk about these other 3 types of data. One is that the adequacy of diet is correlated with mental symptoms. Let's do that next. There are actually too many studies of this type, in my opinion, because they kind of all show the same thing, and they're expensive to do, and I wish that the funding for research would go to other things now, but it's wonderful that they're so consistent. Basically, they all show that eating a whole foods, Mediterranean kind of diet is associated with lower rates of mood and anxiety symptoms, and that eating a Western processed foods diet is associated with higher rates of mood and anxiety symptoms. These are done at population levels, and they're correlational. And correlational data cannot prove causation, right? Because it may just be that the people who don't feel happy crave junky food. So I'll come to that in a minute. Just so you know, these studies have been done all over the world. These are from Australia, Spain, Belgium, etc. There's one, those were all in adults. There's one correlational study that was done in children. I don't know of any other. And it was done here in Alberta, so I had to put this slide into the talk. This was done by a group at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and they studied over 6,000 grade 5 children. And this is just kind of almost a cartoon of their findings, just to simplify it, because it was such an amazing finding that they gave them a healthy index score based on food diaries, and then they asked the kids how worried or sad they were feeling. And the red bar shows that those with the lowest healthy eating score had the highest levels of feeling worried or sad. The blue bar is the healthy eaters, and they reported the fewest feelings of sadness and depression, and the green bar was in between. I mean, what are we doing to our children? You know, it's really scary. So the correlational data do not prove causation. We have to go on to the next type of data, and actually both of the final ones, and they both prove causation. Because it really is possible. I mean, how many of you, when you're having a down day or a blue day or something, say, what I need is a plate of broccoli, you know? I mean, we always laugh at that. We go for mac and cheese or whatever without very many nutrients. There's something, I don't know if it's cultural or what, but that's what we do. So we have to show that the dietary change precedes the onset of the mood or anxiety disorder. And I usually use this study to show it. There are only a few in the world, because these are very expensive longitudinal prospective trials. This is one that came from the university in Spain, and I think it illustrates several things. So they had quite a few thousand, 16,000 former students and professors from the university. There were about 9,000 who reported on mental health, as you'll see in the next slide. So it's still a very good study. They began in 1999. What's very important is that when they began, no one had depression or anxiety. Okay, if they did and they had had a history of it or they had it then, they couldn't get into the study. So these are normal, healthy people from the point of view of mental health. And they were evaluated with semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaires, and they were categorized into 3 groups. So they asked questions about muffin, donut, and croissant intake, and that was commercial baked goods, hamburger, sausage, and pizza, and that became fast foods. It would be a little different here. We'd use hamburgers and French fries probably, right? But anyway. And then they pooled all of that together, it came up with a single score for an unhealthy diet, divided them into thirds. So we're going to do that with those of you in the room here with me now. So we're going to say that the first maybe 5 seats going straight up, okay, so the first third, you are the people who ate a really good diet. You had very low scores on the unhealthy diet. The people in the last 5 seats going up, you're the people who ate a lot of that processed food, and the people in the middle are the middle. So what they did is they divided them into those thirds, and then they sat back and waited to see who would end up with a diagnosis of depression or anxiety. And this is the depression result. So you people on the far left here who were eating so well, some of you simply because we expect a certain number of people to be diagnosed with depression, they assigned your prevalence rate a risk factor of 1.0. Risk of depression 1.0. Okay, so that was kind of baseline. The people in the middle who are eating a moderate amount of processed foods, it's interesting, your risk was really no different. You folks on the far end were in trouble. You had almost a 50% elevated risk of developing depression. So one of the things I like about this is on average 6 years later in about 9,000 people. One of the things I like about this is it doesn't say you have to be a purist. I would never be a good purist about anything myself. I mean, you got to have some treats occasionally, and you know, that's just life. But if on balance you're eating a lot of processed foods, it increases your risk. So the data do not say that muffins or sausage cause depression. What the data say is that with every bite we're making a choice, and you dietitians always tell us to eat the rainbow, right? So we know which one you mean. And when you make a choice most of the time for this kind of thing, then you're elevating your risk for mood disorders, most likely. And that's based on data from Spain that I just showed you. There are also studies from Australia. Okay, I want to go on to treatment because it is in some ways, the strongest kind of data. If you can take someone with mental health symptoms and reverse those symptoms by giving them better diet or nutrients in pill form, that's pretty convincing evidence that suboptimal nutrition was an underlying factor. So this research really needs to be looked at. There are not too many studies of whole diet changes because, again, that's a very costly, time-consuming kind of study to do. But 2 of them came out in the year 2017 that had very similar designs and happened to both be from Australia, but were from completely independent research groups. So one was from Felice Jacka's group and one from Natalie Parletta. So I have, without their permission, tried to squeeze their 2 studies into one set of slides because their results were so similar. They had different acronyms. Don't ask me what the acronyms stand for. SMILES and HELFIMED. Anyway, they both selected adults with major depressive disorder. Now, I know I'm not speaking to a mainly mental health audience here, so just to remind you, that's the kind of depression which is very severe, very enduring, and people can't get out of bed in the morning, and which psychiatrists have told me you cannot get them to change their diet because they feel so awful. So keep that in mind when I show you the results. In both studies, they were randomized to receive 12 weeks of dietary counseling or peer support. Now, we know that peer support is helpful in depression. That's why we try to help our friends and our coworkers more and more now when people confess that they're having trouble with depression. The question was whether dietary counseling would be any better than peer support. I cannot imagine a placebo in this kind of design, right? So this is what you call an active comparator. It's a randomized trial with an active comparator that you expect to be beneficial. You know what the counseling consisted of, but just for a review, this is a typical Mediterranean diet. This is fruits and vegetables, fish twice a week at least, meat if you're not a vegetarian, dairy and eggs, whole grain, not whole wheat, olive oil for your oil of choice, lots of nuts and seeds, and especially this, beans, lentils, etc., and I'm going to come back and talk about that later. The combined results of both studies was that, first of all, lots of people got better in both groups in both studies. What was amazing was how many went into remission. Getting better when you're depressed is one thing, but getting so much better that you no longer meet the criteria for depression, that is impressive. So remission, these numbers are actually from the SMILES trial. 8% of those who receive peer counseling. Remember that when you're helping your friends, you can have a very big effect. People need that support. But look at that, 32% of those who receive dietary counseling. Now here's my little editorial comment on this. Keep in mind that 1/3 has never been achieved by any antidepressant drug that I've ever heard of, and that it was done in only 12 weeks, and with no side effects. Prozac made it to the cover of Time magazine, 1989 or something. Why does the media not cover any of the nutrition and mental health research? I mean, it's phenomenal how it's ignored. Unless it's a single nutrient. So yes, you can take a little bit of magnesium and it might help you, or a little bit of vitamin D, it might help you. But as soon as you get into food, dietary approaches, or multi-nutrients in pill form, there is no coverage. This should have been on the cover of Time magazine, both the studies together. And also, Parletta's work especially showed that those who improved their diet the most as a result of their counseling were the ones who showed the most improvement. So kind of a dose response. The more adherent you are to the Mediterranean diet, the better you did. Did it cost more? This is a huge issue. I get told this all the time. People cannot afford to eat a Mediterranean diet. And I'm going to show you that isn't true, but they showed it to you in this study. And I think this is from the SMILES trial again. These are Australian dollars. Prior to intervention, 138 per week. Post-intervention, 112. If that surprises you, then there are two things you're not thinking about. And I know there are dietitians here. One thing you're not thinking about is the fact that living on potato chips and the other kinds of stuff that 7-Eleven, etc. sells is expensive. And the other thing second thing you're not thinking about is teaching people how to cook from peas and beans and lentils and how cheap that is. Okay, we'll come back to that, as I said. I have to move on to this because we have a small body of literature now on dietary interventions, but we have a much larger literature on nutrients in pill form. And this is where I spent a lot of my research career here, was studying nutrients in pill form. But I often said I was studying a proof of principle because we cannot put the world on pills. That's absurd to think about that. We have to improve the soil and we have to improve eating habits. That's number one. But there is a place for pills, and I'll tell you about it. So a good diet might not be sufficient for optimal brain function. Everybody who's been studying nutrients in pill form has stories, and I do too, of people who had wonderful diets. But when we added additional nutrients in pill form on top of that, symptoms got significantly better. And so clearly there are individual differences, and this is so well documented in physical health. We just don't have it very well documented yet in mental health. But there are people who need, like the amount of, manganese that you need might be more than what I need, and the amount of iron you need might be less than what I need. You know, there are just all these individual differences. You can't rely on peripheral serum levels to show that. There's just differences. And then we have to keep in mind the impoverished nutrient density of the soil. So individual differences and poor nutrient density of the soil are two good reasons to think about nutrients in pill form. The history is not new on this, okay? We've known about individual nutrients in pill form being used to treat psychosis, paranoia, hallucinations, bipolar, etc. And that was when they were discovering that niacin, for example, insufficient niacin could cause psychosis and paranoia. We called it pellagra. Beriberi you've probably heard of, same thing. Even now, psychiatrists test for B12 deficiency if there's psychosis. So the association of nutrient suboptimal is the term I like to use to indicate it's an individual thing. Suboptimal amounts of nutrients and psychiatric symptoms is not a new idea. But when my colleagues and I wrote a big review article in 2007, when we went to the scientific literature from the 1920s up to the year 2000, what we discovered was that every few years people thought they had found the nutrient that was going to solve mental illness. In fact, there's this wonderful conversation in one of the journals in the 1920s where they thought manganese, insufficient manganese, that's why we have psychosis. They were really convinced of that because a couple of people did better when given manganese. But overall, when people did more and more trials, the effects were very modest, and they continue to this day because that's what the federal funding agencies will fund. They won't fund research on multi-nutrient formulas. They'll only fund one nutrient at a time. So you read the studies in the newspaper about vitamin D or calcium or magnesium or whatever, and the effects are quite modest. What is new is, in spite of the fact that the funding agencies haven't paid attention yet, lots of people around the world have been studying multiple nutrients. When you think about those metabolic pathways I showed you, how could you possibly pick out one nutrient to solve a brain problem? That just mystifies me. To me, it shows why education about the brain metabolic pathways is so important, and why I show those slides in every talk I give, no matter to whom. It's really important that people understand the complexity and the breadth of the needs in our brains. So I'm going to divide this little part of the talk into two areas. One is on B complex because it stands alone in terms of benefits, and the other is on broad spectrum, meaning the whole 30 that I was talking about before, the roughly 15 vitamins and roughly 15 minerals. The reason B complex stands alone has nothing to do with mental disorders. I've never heard of anybody with a mental disorder get better with just B complex. But in general population studies, people who are suffering anxiety or stress, students who are having exam stress, people who have just gone through the earthquakes in New Zealand, or this one, which was here in Calgary, where we studied the people who went through the flood. B complex is cheap, it's easy, and it decreases, I don't know if I want to say it decreases stress, it improves resilience, improves coping. And no, I don't have a brand to recommend. I mean, they're all over the place. It just is something that it should be considered. Actually, it's just an aside since I'm speaking in Alberta. Because of our data on the flood study, when the Fort Mac fires happened, I went to the mayor's office, who sent me to the emergency medical center. They sent me to Alberta Health Services, sent me to psychiatry, and psychiatry went to dietitians, and they all said, no, we're not going to tell people to take B complex. And what they said was that the dietitians said, we will put a line in our brochure that says, please try to eat healthy. How can you say that to people who've just lost their kitchens, you know? Anyway, so I got nowhere. And it's very sad because this research is from England, Belgium, Wales, New Zealand, here. I mean, it's all over the world, many clinical trials. Just B complex in any group that is undergoing that kind of stress. Okay, that's done, B complex. Now we're going to talk about broad spectrum. Broad spectrum formulas say, look at these metabolic pathways. We can't pick one vitamin or one mineral. Why don't we give the brain everything it seems to need? Almost all of them are, go out in our urine if you have too much. None of them are ever given in mega doses. They're all below tolerable upper levels, no matter if you're talking about the formulas developed here or the ones in England. And why don't we study those? And so there is this body of literature in mental disorders using a broad spectrum approach. The broad spectrum formulas have been studied in all of these things, and there's no way I can cover all of those in my remaining time. So I've picked out a few things, especially ADHD, because we're at Children's Hospital. Now, there are different broad spectrum formulas in the world. On this slide, we have the two that were developed in Alberta. And remember from my disclosure slide, I am not affiliated with any of these companies. And the third one was developed at Arizona State University at the Autism Nutrition Research Center. In addition, there are formulas that are not really formulas. There are people like in England and the Netherlands who have done basically 25 to 30 minerals and vitamins together in prison populations and in various kinds of groups with explosive rage. But they are not a formula that you can build a literature on because each study kind of puts their own thing together. And so these three all have a literature and replication across multiple universities, which is what we require in science. What these three have in common is that no one who has studied any of them ever gains financially from sales. Not many of you are in the mental health field, but I think you understand what a phenomenal statement that is, because some of us are old enough to remember when that was true in psychiatry too. But we now have a whole generation of mental health literature really corrupted by pharmaceutical money. And the people studying nutrition didn't want to take that pathway. So the companies never, ever fund the research or influence it. Another thing they have in common is that there are all these broad spectrum, roughly 30 ingredients. And another thing is replication in multiple studies, including randomized placebo-controlled trials showing that they improve mood regulation. Now, the third one that was developed at the Autism Research Center, of course, focused on people with autism. So I'm going to focus on the two that have been used more generally, and they were developed in Alberta. This was the first study on one of them. It was my own. And it was using a design which is underappreciated. When you have something novel, you don't jump to a randomized controlled trial. It's just silly. You need to explore it, and that's true in any field. And so the nice thing about nutrients is that you can do within subject crossover designs. What that means is we can take a child, study that child at baseline, give them the formula, see what happens, take the formula away, see what happens, give it back, see what happens, on-off control. If you can show on-off control of symptoms with the within-subject crossover, that's very powerful pilot data. So this is one boy who we published in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology, and this is the kind of data that we were finding on multiple people, but this is just a sample. This is a total score out of 3 for mood on the left and temper on the right. And you can see at baseline it was quite high. Put this boy on this formula, and it came way down. We did not have a placebo in those days, so we had to just take it away. And then his mood went back up, big problems, explosive rage, put him back on it. And I actually ended up, just coincidentally, this particular family I got to know socially through a different setting. And we ended up, I still know this boy, and he's 33, I think. Okay, so it's been quite a few years. And he takes his pills. He makes sure he gets his nutrients every day in pill form. And he cooks and tries to eat well. And this was his temper. It showed the same thing as mood, on-off control. Much more recently, a group in New Zealand, which is a very important group, they're the most active group right now studying these broad spectrum formulas developed in Alberta. Julia Ruckledge is the chief investigator, but this was her student Heather Gordon in 2015, had a group of 14 school-aged children using the Connors Parent Rating Form and a T-score. This is, the red line shows normal score, okay, normal behavior, and this group at baseline was way up here. Then they were put on one of the Alberta formulas, and you can see they came down into the normal range, taken off, and they went back up, and then down and up, okay? And they did that as part of their pilot work prior to their randomized controlled trials. So I'm going to show you a little bit of those two trials now. This is improvement in self-rated ADHD symptoms in a placebo-controlled RCT in adults with ADHD. Now, the only thing about my next, I think it's 3 slides, bar graphs, is that they are shown as improvement. So you don't want to see the bar go down. It's not symptom decrease. You want to see it go up. I apologize for making you change your mental set, okay? But you've eaten well this morning, so you can do that, right? So this is the reduction in ADHD symptoms over 8 weeks in adults. Always the saturated color is the group that got the micronutrients, the minerals and vitamins, and the lighter color is placebo. And you can see not only is it statistically significant, but it's a moderate effect size, very good effect size. This is in inattention in adults, and I'm showing you this one for an interesting reason. When we study kids with ADHD, we really have trouble evaluating their attention. And I know that from years of trying. Anyway, this is in adults with inattention. And in this case, the adults who, when they broke the blind, the adults who had been on the micronutrients, a broad spectrum, one of the Alberta formulas, their self-reported inattention just got so much better. And we hear this from people all the time, how much better they can focus, they're no longer in a fuzzy cloud, etc. The observer, which was usually a spouse, could detect some of that improvement. The clinician could not detect it because inattention is so internal. And that's one of the reasons we have so much trouble studying it in children, because you ask them about their focus and inattention, and it's very hard for like an 8-year-old to tell you. Now, what about mood? It just happened that 25% of the sample that was published in this RCT is published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. No press coverage, little aside. A quarter of them met criteria for major depression. That's not why they were selected, but a quarter, we need studies on major depression. So Julia Ruckledge pulled out those 21 and asked the question, how did they look in terms of their score on the MADRS, the Montgomery-Asperger Depression Rating Scale. And as you can see, those who had gotten the active did much better than those who were on the placebo. So we know also from lots of anecdotes and single cases that we have to get a study on depression going, but it hasn't happened yet. This is the other RCT, and it's in children with ADHD, and it was published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. Relative to placebo, when they broke the blind, there were significant improvements in emotion regulation, aggression, and general functioning. Notice something, for those of you who know something about ADHD. The cardinal symptoms of ADHD are not on that list. What we find across all of our studies is no matter what the diagnostic category, the symptoms that improve the most are emotion regulation, explosive rage, aggression, whatever you want to call it, and some level of overall well-being. Sometimes also you get improvement in attention, etc., but that is no matter if they're bipolar, if they're ADHD, whatever. Those are the symptoms. In general, on the Clinical Global Index, there were almost twice as many who got the micronutrients who were much to very much improved. Just so you know, she did 1-year follow-up, and the people who stayed on the nutrients were much better than those who did not. So just a word about autism. There's one study, I actually helped out with it here. 3 of us from Alberta helped out with it. And this was done by Dr. Louis Meal-Madrona. It was a case control study of 44 adults on the autism spectrum who wanted to be treated with medication, or whose family wanted to be treated with medication, and 44 age and sex matched and severity matched who wanted to try micronutrients. And both groups improved. But it was the measures on mood regulation in particular where nutrients were really superior. And it shows very well here. This is the medication group, and they did get better. Okay, this is a decrease on a score of the Aberrant behavior checklist. But the group on micronutrients got much more better, right? Significantly better. And especially in irritability and self-injurious behavior. And I try to show this slide whenever I'm talking to clinicians, because this is something, this variable needs to be replicated. We did not predict this at all. Nobody predicted it. Watching your child banging, self-harming is one of the most excruciating things for parents to deal with. And we measured self-injurious behavior and found that the intensity was dramatically different in those who got, here's the medication group, and there's really no change. The micronutrient group, it dropped by 50%. And that has not yet been replicated. We need more research on that. And of course, I'm not mentioning this with every study, but everybody's collecting adverse events. We're publishing on safety and lack of toxicity, and this is typical. The micronutrient group had 1/6 of the adverse events of those taking medication. Okay. Now, there is a summary article that came out recently. I'm not a great fan of this for a variety of reasons, but they did their best to try to ask about the overall role of nutrition for autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. They categorized the research this way. They said, okay, it looks like group differences are hard to demonstrate, but there are always some individuals who benefit if you try a gluten-free, casein-free diet. And I'll talk about the exception on the next slide. A ketogenic diet, food additive exclusion diet, sugar exclusion diets, few foods diet, the oligoantigenic diet, polyunsaturated fatty acids, but only for ADHD, no convincing data on autism. So individuals, you will get some individuals improving in those. But if you want to find significant group differences, meaning that there is more generalization, probiotics, sorry, was at the bottom there. The more promising group data is in two areas. The gluten-free, casein-free diet for individuals on the autism spectrum who have been pre-selected for the presence of gastrointestinal concerns. And you dietitians are probably aware of that. And secondly, the broad-spectrum micronutrient supplementation, although most of the data is on ADHD, not ASD. Okay? And there are many more studies that I don't have time to show you, but in summary, there are lots of individual differences. But the promising research, I mean, most of us have large effect sizes in any of our group studies for broad-spectrum formulas, and you don't get that for many interventions. This is just to show you we've studied things like database analysis of a large number of adults with bipolar disorder, 50% drop in symptoms in 3 months, and sustained at 6 months. That means it couldn't have been a placebo or an expectancy effect. That's very important. And we did that for ADHD also. Quick look at psychosis. Because the patient was from this hospital, we had a child who in 2008 was an inpatient here who had really severe psychosis. He was described to me as the sickest patient they'd ever had on inpatients here. And he came in with a CJAS, Children's General Adaptive Functioning, something like that. Sorry, I just went blank. CJAS score of 35. After 6 months and every kind of medication trial, he was sent home with a CJAS of 35. They could do nothing for him. The family had heard about the Alberta formulas. They went to their outpatient psychiatrist and said, could we try one? She said, this sounds like snake oil, but I don't have anything better to offer. And they called me in to help with the data. And this is his psychosis symptom score as it went consistently down in 2019, and his hallucinations, visual and auditory, as they went down to 0. And we still follow him. He still has residual anxiety, which is hard to figure why, but he does. And his low IQ has never changed. And we're Facebook buddies. And he graduated from high school. And most children with childhood psychosis, that's quite a statement. But why I'm telling you is because a health economist looked at the 6 months of inpatient care, which did nothing for him, compared it to the immediately following 6 months of outpatient care on micronutrients, and we could be saving our healthcare system a lot of money. I know you want to know, can we predict who will respond to micronutrients? Julia Ruckledge's group in New Zealand has just published their second article looking at everything, serum levels, MTHFR, genotyping. Nothing predicts clinical benefit. We don't know yet. really. How to predict? Just try it. This is a bunch of the things that they have examined as predictors. I want to move to my final point, practical suggestions. I don't want people leaving here thinking that I'm saying go buy pills, okay? I am not. I think for the general population, what you dietitians are doing, I'm sure you're trying to get people to eat a whole foods diet, trying to teach them to cook, etc. It has broader societal implications. So I'm going to go over a few of them. You've heard this. Don't eat anything that your ancestors would not recognize as being food. I think Michael Pollan said that. Focus on the importance of real food first. Other things like specialized diets. Okay, people will try them out, and some of them, there'll be individual differences, some of them will benefit. But, you know, go for where the money is. I think that famous bank robber said, he robs banks because that's where the money is. Whole food. Teach people to eat whole food. And don't tell them that the soil might be depleted, okay? But do whatever you can if you have any impact in the world. There are lots of good people who are working on the soil. I've been giving lectures to some of them and talk to them about the importance for our nation's mental health. Think about those metabolic pathways before every meal. I mean, if you think about those, how can you not try to get some of those minerals and vitamins into your brain? Think about your afternoon schedule and what you want to do this afternoon. Teach people to eat this and not this. There's my Western food diet slide. You knew what it would look like. And certainly not this. For breakfast, get people back to eating porridge with nuts and seeds and raisins or whatever. Not this, or God forbid, Pop-Tarts. You can say something soft like, there's an increasing amount of scientific data showing that what we eat influences how we feel. Let's talk about your diet. And then you can use Amy Paxton's Start the Conversation questionnaire. There's no right answer, there's no scoring. You just ask, well, how many times in a week do you think you eat fast food? How many times do you eat fruit, vegetables, sodas? And then all you know is the picture of the patient sitting in front of you, and you can work toward improving that, okay? You want to teach them about this and to stay away from that. And you know that already. We can teach children about feeding their brains that food doesn't have to be a treat. I'm appalled at this generation that thinks that food has to always be a treat, that eating out should be a rare event, that assembling dinner is not the same as cooking dinner, although I'll bet we've all assembled an occasional dinner. And you can teach them what nutrients do in the brain. I show them the metabolic pathways and they get it. Rely first on food for your nutrients. This cartoon is to reward you for listening to me for so long. The mother says, "Good morning, Jeremy. What can I get for you? Greek yogurt, egg white omelet, avocado toast, or oatmeal?" He's in high school. He sits there and says, "Just pass me that bowl of leftover nacho chips." She says, "I'll slice a vitamin on top." Okay? But first, improve the diet. And for treatment, try always to treat first with nutrients. This is my view of a better world, and I have a study that needs to be done if anyone works in Emerge. Every child who comes in crisis, every child with an emotional or behavioral disorder, or not disorder, problem, forget the disorder categories, should be given the opportunity of first being treated with nutrition before exposing their developing brains to psychiatric medications. And because I have so many studies that I want done, but I'm retired and not doing them anymore, in 2015, I opened two charitable funds, one in Canada and one in the US. The one here in Canada is managed by the Calgary Foundation in Canada. I've raised almost $600,000, and it's all distributed, supporting clinical trials on broad-spectrum nutrient treatment in the US, Canada, and New Zealand so far, but in the US in 3 different sites. But we have more studies that need to be done if you know of potential sources of funding, or if you know people who might want to do research, who have the skills and ability to do that. I would really love to talk to them. Or if you just have questions, feel free to email me. That's my email address. Thank you for your time. Yeah.